Yes. All right.
Nice. So you all get a kick out of this. Since you're native plant people, I been trying to track down all the different native oaks down here and having a lot of fun with that lately. And just the differences in all the acorn sizes and everything has been phenomenal. So I have, this little guy, which is our swamp white oak. You can see the peduncle on the acorn, which is really unique.
Wow.
And then this big, massive bur oak, of course, that's right outside my office. And it's just been really fun finding all these different acorns.
Oh my goodness.
Do you know what's odd? Over the last 2 years, I have little bur oaks coming up all over my property.
Mhm.
And I'm always walking the neighborhood. And there is not a bur oak to be seen. And I don't know where these acorns came from. I guess the Blue Jays could carry them far. But I look and I'm like, where are all these bur oak seedlings coming from? And I just feel so guilty taking them out, but I have too many trees on the lot and I don't have room for an oak.
Sure.
Because it's not that big of a lot. And I mean, I just love oak so much. So I feel so guilty every time I pull one out. And then then I got 3 more. It's like,
Should blame the squirrels, right?
I guess, but I don't know I just don't know where they're bringing them from. I guess they have bigger territories than I thought.
That's funny.
I wanted to ask you, since we have a little bit of time, do you have, I have yet to see, a lot of times people, of course we love oaks being like the #1 keystone species. But a lot of the people in our area, myself included, don't necessarily have big enough property to support a lot of oaks.
Mm-hmm.
I have never seen in person a dwarf, what is it, chinkapin oak?
Dwarf chinkapin oak, right?
Do you have them down there growing wild, and how big do they truly get, so that I know if I can recommend that to people?
So good questions. Yes, I have seen them, but not in Illinois. So there's a little confusion between chinkapin and dwarf chinkapin taxonomically. The leading thought now is we don't have dwarf chinkapin native populations in Illinois, though we have planted populations. It does occur in Missouri, just across the river. And then it occurs farther south as well. And typically it's in kind of dry limestoney habitats is where you would find it. And it is almost a shrub, right? 30 feet would be a big one for sure. So they're small. They can be found in the trade, so you can buy them occasionally, and you would want a site that's really well drained and has higher pH if you can.
Okay, so 30 feet tall would be big. So on average, we're talking, 20-ish.
20, 25, something like that. At least in the wild, but these are in the wild, they grow in pretty rough conditions, right? Some dry sites. In a really good site, it might grow a little bigger, but they're fairly small.
Okay, and how wide do they get? And are they shrub-like or trunk-like, like single trunk tree-like?
I'm not that familiar with them. I've seen them, but I'm not, I don't know them very well. I would say from what I've seen, they're short single trunks. And then, so you're looking at a 5 to 8 foot center trunk, and then it'll split into its canopy. And it's about as wide as it is tall, something like that.
Okay. So it is more manageable for a smaller landscape.
Yeah. Think like a flowering dogwood or something like that.
Okay.
Kind of that size.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's one that depending on who you talk to, it's been going back and forth whether we've had it or not. And I think the general gist is we don't really have a native population in Illinois. That would be our 21st native species if it actually was here.
That's the presentation I saw you give, I think it was sometime last year. It was your presentation on native trees, I believe, and you were talking
Okay.
about all the different species of native oaks that we have. I remember that. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, that's one of my passions, right? I love oaks, and I really enjoy dendrology or just botany around trees. So it's kind of fun. Not that I don't love talking about invasive species. I mean, that's good too.
We gotta know it, but
Yeah.
we gotta know it. We figure if we can just get people to add a few native plants to their landscape and get rid of invasives, we're doing a good thing.
Absolutely. I agree completely.
Anything else you want to deal with, Mary? Or are we good?
No, I think we're good. I'm hearing you fine. You're looking fine, and I think we're ready. So
Sounds good.
wait for people to come.
What zone are you down there?
We are 7 here, 7A or whatever, the higher 7, the colder 7.
Really? So the southern tip of Illinois is actually a 7, not a 6.
Just in the very, very like the very southern tip. And when I say southern tip, you got to realize where I'm at. I'm 15 minutes from Paducah, Kentucky. So I'm about as far south as you can get and still be in Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah. And so once you get into that, basically, the southern tip of Illinois, once you get south of the Shawnee Hills, you get into what's called the coastal plain ecosystems here. And so that coastal plain ecosystem, which is an extension of the Mississippi River Valley, of course, that part of Illinois kind of falls into that zone 7.
Wow, it's hard to believe that there's a part of Illinois that's a zone 7.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long state, right? So
Yeah.
from where I'm at, I can literally be in Atlanta, Georgia quicker than I can be in Chicago. I mean, it's that, just to give you a sense of where we're at.
Wow, and you're the same. I like Tennessee, and you're the same zone as Tennessee.
Parts of Tennessee, I'm sure, yeah.
Okay.
They're probably 7B or whatever, but yeah.
You're right. We're up here. You do have to travel really far to get anywhere. You
Yeah.
know, you're just kind of stuck. Not so much if you want to go north, but when you go south, you got a long way to go.
Yep. Don't let that dissuade you from visiting the Southern Illinois and the Shawnee National Forest. It's definitely worth the drive.
I want to do a hiking trip down there.
Mhm.
Do you have any recommendations on where to stay? If I wanted to come down with some friends and do like a 2-3 day hiking trip.
Are you looking for a campground or a B&B or a hotel cabin? What are you looking for to stay?
Probably either a hotel cabin or a B&B.
So there's kind of Airbnbs scattered throughout. And so depending on where you want to hike, you can find those everywhere. There's some really nice cabins close to Garden of the Gods. I think they're called Rimrock cabins. There's some cabins at Giant City that are state-owned that are, the cabins are okay, but you're right in Giant City, which is a wonderful place to be as well. And so those are 2 really good.
Giant City.
Yep. So if you've never been to Giant City State Park or heard of it, it is probably our most visited park down here. It's it's right on that escarpment where the sandstone bluffs are. And so it has a lot of really tall sandstone bluffs that have these vertical cracks and fissures in them, which create like city blocks, is why they call it Giant City.
Okay.
So really, really interesting. And for a plant wise, there's a nature preserve called Fern Rocks Nature Preserve that is within Giant City that has, in my opinion, some of the best spring wildflowers that you'll find in Southern Illinois.
Wonderful. That sounds
Really,
like
really beautiful.
Like a lovely spring trip.
Yep. So that would be on my list. If you're an animal person, then you should check out the Snake Road if you haven't heard of that. So that's where we have the big snake migrations at LaRue Pine Hills, where you can see many, many different species of snake, but also it's a
I
wonderful
very
place.
much appreciate their part in the ecosystem, but I'll take a pass on that one.
Okay, that's fair enough. I understand. I had a buddy that came down and visited it just last week, and he said he saw 32 water moccasins on his hike. So that's not for
Wow.
everybody, I understand.
Well, kind of had that going on here. We had a kind of an invasion of garter snakes in my neighborhood this year.
wow.
They were all over the place. And it was quite the neighborhood complaint. And I would be outside and I'd see snakes slithering across the patio, and I would tell myself, they show a healthy ecosystem. They're an important member of the ecosystem.
Right.
All righty. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start. Before I do, I'm going to ask everyone if you would please turn off your video and keep your sound turned off. The video will help our bandwidth, just to be sure that we don't have any problems with people viewing our guest tonight. We have quite a few people signed up, so this could be a highly attended event. My name is Catherine Bryla, and I am a team member of Sagamore Native Plant Community. For those of you who are not very familiar with our organization, we are an all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit in the near west and southwest suburbs of Chicago. Our mission is to promote native plant use and ecological landscape practices in suburban landscapes. Please consider following us on social media and visit our website, sagmoraine.org, for more information on what we do and ways you can help us. I want to introduce our special guest this evening, Christopher Evans from the University of Illinois Extension. Chris is an extension forestry and research specialist with the University of Illinois, where he also serves as the interim state coordinator of the Illinois Master Naturalist Program. He specializes in forest management, forest health, invasive species, and agroforestry. Here with his presentation, The Green Pathway to Invasion, ladies and gentlemen, Chris Evans. Good evening, Chris.
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate the invite to come speak to you all. I do realize I'm preaching to the choir, I guess you would say it a little bit here with this topic. But I do think it'll be fun, and I hope that I leave time for questions or discussion at the end. So I'm excited about that. But I'll just jump right in. This is a presentation that I've given a few other places, and I like this topic in the sense that it addresses really this particular pathway for invasive species, the use of invasive plants in horticulture or in landscaping. And so I think it's a worthy topic, particularly for people that that are making those kind of choices. So whether you're a landowner or a landscape designer or an arborist or anybody that kind of has decision-making power on what to put on the land, what to put in your yard or other people's yards, it's an important topic. So I'm going to talk about several things. We will cover some basics, but again, I would imagine it's going to be not a lot new to you all, but it's good to cover, and then get into why invasive species were introduced in the first place. And then really the deep dive is going to be this ornamental pathway of introduction. And we'll talk about the traits of invasive species, why are invasive plants still being used, and highlight three major invaders that are still commonly planted, and then end with a little bit of what we can do about this. And again, I hope we have plenty of time for questions. But you know, invasive species are something that we all deal with, regardless of whether you own 1 acre or you're a land manager of thousands of acres. And this is a picture that highlights one invasive species, and this is a shot I took a few years ago, and everything that's kind of gray green in the screen there, that's all autumn olive. So this was a site that had was slated for tree planting, and they could not get trees in there because the autumn olive infestation was so great. But, you know, there's other invaders, like bush honeysuckle here. There's a lot of issues, and we often don't just deal with one. Many times we're dealing with multiple species at the same time. And so they keep cropping up as an issue with conservation, with natural communities against native plants. There's a constant problem, and it really is not limited to forest. It's any habitat that you happen to be in, whether you're in wetlands, prairies, full aquatic ecosystems, kind of urban ecosystems, forest. There's invasive species that you deal with in Illinois. So I do like to cover kind of the technical definition of invasive, because that's a term that's used quite a bit out there. And it's used differently depending on who you talk to some. So I like to give my definition, and the definition that's kind of, there's more of a consensus around of what an invasive is. So we're all kind of on the same page. And so I consider an invasive species it's a species that is not native to that ecosystem. So that's the first clue right there, the characteristic. It's not a natural part of that ecosystem. It was developed, or it was native to somewhere else. It has since been introduced to this new ecosystem, and it has escaped and naturalized. And that just means it's formed free living populations in the wild that's taking care of themselves, right? There's new populations in the wild of these exotic species. And those populations have to grow to a level, or have the potential to grow to a level, that they're disrupting natural functionings or natural communities of the area. So that could be, you know, losing species, you're changing diversity, you're impacting ecological functioning. And that kind of disruption and that change to our natural systems, our native communities, and our ecology, we consider that damage, right? So that could be ecological damage, economic damage, environmental damage, however you want to say it. There has to be a negative consequence of that non-native species now being on the landscape for us to call it an invasive. There's lots of examples of species that have escaped and naturalized, but don't cause that kind of damage, don't really do significant disruptions. So I wouldn't consider them invasive species. And there's lots of examples of native species that we control sometimes or want to manage, like poison ivy, even Canada goldenrod at times, or ragweed. I don't consider those invasive species because they're native to our ecosystems, right? So it kind of has to have all of those characteristics for me to consider them an invasive. Now, when you talk about invasive plants, how do they become invasive? They really are faster or more efficient at acquiring these limited resources that all plants, and we all remember this from, you know, basic biology, that all plants need water, sunlight, nutrients, and space. And the plants that are better, faster, or more efficient at acquiring those resources, or have the ability to limit those resources from the other plants, are going to win out, right? And so they kind of win that competition and then grow more. And so invasive plants do that, and we see kind of certain characteristics cropping up over and over again. Things like really high seed production, where we'll get thousands of seeds. And this happens to be Japanese chaff flower. It's a new invader, relatively new invader in Southern Illinois. And we're seeing something like, you know, 15-20,000 seeds per square meter that it can develop. So really, really high seed production just overwhelms the seed bank. Other invaders have longer growing seasons. And again, this is bush honeysuckle. We've all seen this, where this plant, the shrub, greens up usually 2.5 to 3 weeks earlier than a lot of our native shrubs, and then stays green 2.5, 3, sometimes even 4 weeks later than a lot of our native shrubs. And so over the course of a year, this honeysuckle has almost 2 months more photosynthetic time each year to grow than our native shrubs. And so it's no wonder that it can grow fast and capture a lot of resources if it has that much more time to grow. Others can modify habitat, and this is kudzu. And if you're not familiar with kudzu, we called it in the South where I grew up, the vine that ate the South, and we played games of looking for animal shapes in kudzu and all that. So it's well known for anybody that grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line. But it is a shade intolerant plant that doesn't like shade. And so what it can do is grow up and over the trees and basically kill the trees, shade them out, and get rid of that shade so it can keep moving in there. So it modifies the habitat to its own preferences. And so it's not a lot of plants can do that, but this is one that really drastically can do that. Others just have early growth or reproduce early. This is garlic mustard, and garlic mustard, of course, is one of our earliest flowering invasive plants and gets a lot of its reproduction done very early, which makes it a threat or a direct competitor to a lot of our native wildflowers. But by doing that early reproduction, it's kind of getting a jump start. Other species have allelopathy, and so allelopathy is something we see in a lot of plant species. It is certainly not unique to invasives. Everybody knows that something like black walnut, you can only plant certain things around it because it has this allelopathic property where it gives chemicals out of its roots that inhibit the growth of other plants. And so we're finding a lot of invasive species have some level of allelopathy in their systems, kind of more so than normal. So it seems to be a trait that is one of those predictor traits for invasives, that they have the ability to kind of change the chemistry in the soil to give themselves a head start, if you will. And it's interesting with these, and a lot of people ask, why do invasive plants, like how can they produce more seed or how can they grow faster? And there's some theories behind that, but by and large, it comes down to any plant in its native environment has a whole bunch of interactions that happen every day, right? So there's insects that feed on them. There's diseases that are fungi that they host. There's all kinds of these interactions, and these plants have kind of found an equilibrium with all their predators and parasites and things that are interacting with them, and it comes at an ecological cost a little bit, right? So our native plants are kept in check a little bit because they're constantly interacting with all these other organisms and kind of working with them or getting fed on a little bit or whatever. Well, when you take a plant or a species and pluck it out of that complex web of interactions and drop it into a new environment, sometimes the organisms that's in that new environment, the fungi and the insects and whoever, haven't really don't really have the ability to feed on that plant or they have that plant host them or anything like that. So the interactions aren't there. And so that plant in a new environment has lost all those checks and balances. It doesn't have those interactions to kind of keep it in check. So it's able to grow a little faster than it does in its native environment, or produce a little more seed than it does in its native environment. And that kind of release from all of these interactions gives it that slight bit of a competitive edge, which lets it kind of win out against the native plants, which are dealing with all those interactions in their native environment at the same time, if that makes sense. And so these invasives are kind of free from those checks, and that lets them have that competitive advantage. And we know that these invasive species are a big issue, and they're really becoming more and more universally recognized as a problem with natural resources or conservation. Just for example, the Forest Service considers invasive species one of the 4 major threats to our forest and grasslands of our country. And so that's right up there with habitat loss and climate change, those sorts of things. And in Illinois, our Illinois Wildlife Action Plan considers invasive species one of the 6 primary challenges to conservation in Illinois. And so, it's up there. It's one of those things that if you're dealing with any kind of conservation or natural resources, invasive species are something you have to deal with. So just some examples of invaders that cause problems or do some damage. And so we talked about allelopathy. So garlic mustard is one of those allelopathic plants. And what's been discovered through research is that garlic mustard gives off a chemical out of its roots that basically serves as a fungicide, and it'll inhibit the growth of the mycorrhizal community in the soil. And a lot of our native plants, many of our native plants kind of require that association with this soil fungi to be able to better take up nutrients and grow. Well, the mustards in general is a group that doesn't really utilize that much. And so with garlic mustard, by being able to keep the growth of that native fungi down, it's reducing the growth of all its competitors and giving itself a competitive edge. So that's just one way that we're seeing that garlic mustard is invasive and damages or impacts our native communities. Another is Japanese stiltgrass, which is well entrenched in the southern half of the state, but has been found all the way to the Wisconsin line. It's another one where we're seeing infestations lead to big drops of species. There was work out of Eastern Illinois University that had some long-term plots that found these plots. They monitored for several years, and then stiltgrass kind of invaded that area. And once stiltgrass invaded those plots, they lost about half their species within the first 3 years of stiltgrass taking over. And so it was big diversity losses to as a result of this invasion. And there's others, you know, we could keep going about these damages, but it gets kind of depressing. So I'll just hit one more. As our exotic shrubs. And so this would be buckthorns and honeysuckles and autumn olives. And there's been a lot of research on those. And there's some indications, although it's a little variable, that birds are shrub nesting native birds that try to nest in invaded forest. They have much higher rates of nest predation, basically because the branching architecture of these shrubs, these exotic shrubs, they branch a little lower to the ground. The branching is a little more visible because it's below the major canopy. And so when birds are kind of forced to nest in these shrubs, because that's what's in the forest, their nests are a little more visible, a little more vulnerable to predation by rat snakes or raccoons and things like that. And so a forested area becomes a population sink for these birds, where they're not reproducing enough to kind of keep the population going, versus a source where they're producing more and more birds. And that's a big shift and a big problem, I think, on the landscape level. And there's some other things with shrubs, this early phenology, this early leaf out, where they produce leaves a lot earlier than our native species, really impacts reptile use of these sites. And there's been some research out there showing that reptiles, when they first come out, snakes particularly, when they first come out in the spring, they're cold. They need to bask in the sun to warm up right after coming out of hibernation. But things like honeysuckle, when they come out of hibernation and the honeysuckle's already green and already capturing that sunlight, suddenly they don't have that ability to warm up like they need to, and it has health implications. And they're finding that the reptiles will actually kind of leave those hibernacula and not use them anymore, just because they're no longer useful because of the invasives. And there's a lot of research out there now showing that some actually human health problems with some of these exotic shrubs, particularly with ticks and tick-borne diseases. So they're areas that are invaded by some of these shrubs. They're finding much higher levels of ticks, and then much higher prevalence of ticks that are carriers for tick-borne diseases, simply because these kind of invaded sites have much higher humidity at the ground level, higher tick survivorship, and things like that. So there's a lot of changes due to all of these different invasives. But how do these invasives, or like, what's the process of becoming invasive? Once a species arrives in its new environment, we don't know that it's going to become the next big invasive, and it doesn't immediately start being an invasive. There's actually kind of steps to a species becoming invasive, or processes. So first, obviously, the species needs to be introduced. Once that species is introduced, it has to then escape from its original planting and kind of form that first kind of free living individuals. Those free living individuals that have escaped from captivity or cultivation have to again naturalize and establish and form a self-perpetuating population. And those self-perpetuating populations have to grow to a level to start causing damage. And so what we found is that these are almost filters, and plants, many species that are introduced kind of stop at one or other of these filters. And so it stops certain plants, and then they have to be able to or not be able to move to the next phase. And so you get the question, or at least I do, about, are all exotic species problematic? Do they all become invasive? And the answer is no. Really, it's a small portion of the species that are introduced end up really becoming problematic invasive plants. And there's actually been people that have looked at this and kind of came up mathematically with those numbers of what percentage. And so this is called the tens rule, which to me is pretty interesting. And they say that on average, looking at all the species that's been introduced across taxa, so plants, animals, everything, that on average about 10% of the species are able to pass through each of these transitional phases, all the way from introduction to invasive species. So it's a filter. Each step filters out about 90% of the species. So that means if you start with 1,000 different introduced species, you introduce 1,000 species into Illinois or into North America, only about 10% of those introduced species are going to be able to escape. So that'd be about 100. Out of those 100, only about 10% or 10 of those will actually naturalize and form a free living population that's self-perpetuating. Out of those 10 naturalized plants, only one's really going to grow to the level to be problematic and considered invasive. And so really you get then about 1 out of every 1,000 species that are introduced ends up becoming invasive. Now, 900 of those species will never even escape. So they just were introduced. The climate wasn't hospitable or something, but it's a small number of species that end up becoming invasive. The problem is those few that do become invasive can be really problematic. Think about, again, all the acres that are covered in garlic mustard, or all the acres that are covered in honeysuckle just in Illinois. And we see that different species are invasive in different areas, of course, which makes sense. And a lot of that is driven by climate. And so this map is a map of the world climate, and it's basically moisture and temperature. And so you see in Illinois where that dark green. If you get down to southern Illinois where I'm at, it's that right at the border, that light yellow. So if you look elsewhere in the world where we have similar climates, we're looking at parts of Eastern Asia, China, Korea, Japan, parts of Europe as well. So it's no surprise that our invasive species that we have here are things like purple loosestrife, English ivy, garlic mustard, which come from Europe, Sericea lespedeza, bush honeysuckle, and others that come from Korea and Eastern China. It's a climate match. If you go into parts of Korea and Eastern China, you're basically walking into an oak hickory forest that looks very similar to what you would expect in southern Illinois. Right, different species, but ecologically very similar. So that's another kind of requirement. And if you go out west, their species are going to be different. They're going to be kind of steppe species, Mongolian species, Russian species, things that have that similar climate as well. So how did these invasives get here? Well, they were introduced, right? They did not naturally migrate on their own. There was some barrier that kept them from getting here naturally. And so we introduced them. They were introduced, some accidentally, some intentionally. But we are the reason, humans are the reason that they've made it into these new environments and have been introduced into areas where they're now non-native. And there's a ton of reasons that plants have been introduced over the years. Some are accidental, seed, plant material, contaminant, or ballast water, things that are just hitching rides, or packing material. So one that probably everybody knows that is a great example of a packing material invasive species is emerald ash borer, right? So emerald ash borer, if you all know, is the little beetle that's killing our ash trees all across Illinois. It is thought that it first arrived in the US as a hitchhiker on crates and dunnage, wooden packing material in shipments. And I think that's how it made its way here. But what I'm going to spend kind of the rest of the talk on is this idea of intentional introductions. And there's a bunch of reasons, right? Erosion control, agriculture for wildlife. And then the big one that we're really going to focus on is this idea of ornamental invaders and as a reason of why we're bringing plants over. But let's start with some of these other reasons just for fun. I like to collect these old pamphlets because I think it's informative and interesting, where there's old pamphlets that tout why you should plant multiflora rows for living fences and wildlife cover, why autumn olive is great for wildlife and conservation. And I love that the wildlife they're highlighting is the exotic ringneck pheasant. Russian olive for wildlife, Sericea lespedeza for erosion control. These things were planted intentionally, and not only planted, but promoted heavily. The state grew these species and gave them away to people, or they were cost share money given to people to plant these. And in defense of that practice, when this was happening in the 50s and through the 60s, even earlier potentially, people didn't understand this concept of invasive species. They thought that they were bringing new species with new resources to our wildlife and doing what they thought was the best for wildlife, without really realizing all the negative consequences of these species moving on the environment. So I do want to give them a little bit of a pass for that, because I think they truly thought that this was the best thing for conservation. We now realize that what little wildlife benefits come from these species, or benefits come from these species, are far outweighed by the negative ecological cost of them being on the landscape. But kind of one of my favorites of these, is kudzu. And if you haven't picked up on it, I do have a bit of a Southern accent, though I do try to hide it. And so again, this is a plant that I grew up with. And it's really interesting how kudzu was really, really planted and promoted for everything from, they call it porch vines that you would grow over your house to look beautiful. It was actually erosion control. They planted it as a crop for cattle forage, lots of different things that were it was promoted for. And in fact, there was a competition in the 1937 for people to really tout how much they loved kudzu. And so there was an award-winning poem by a person that called themselves the Countess of Kudzu. And I'll read this poem for you just to show you what people thought about kudzu at the time. So it says, "In our section of the woods, you save your soil and soul with kudzu. No one suffers from the floods who gives a little time to kudzu. Nor gash nor gully ere denewed to covers up his land with kudzu." So it's really fascinating that it was this was kind of at the Dust Bowl era, and in the South anyways, it was plant kudzu to save your soil, to stop the land loss, to stop the Dust Bowl, to stop the erosion. So it was really, really fascinating to see kind of the thought patterns back then. But let's move on to the main topic, this idea of invasive ornamentals. And this is, again, a major pathway of introduction and spread of invasive species. And there's a lot of cultivars out there, a lot of different horticultural plants being planted, being introduced, being offered for sale throughout North America or in the world, really, and it's only growing. So this was some research from 2010 just to show the kind of constant, steady increase in the number of horticultural cultivars that are being offered for sale. And it's just constantly getting more and more. So it's really interesting. And we see that some of the traits that people look for in a good ornamental tend to line up suspiciously with some of the traits that make some of our worst invasive species. So a good ornamental is something that's hardy, it's easy to grow. A bad invasive is something that's a habitat generalist, it really grows anywhere. A good ornamental is carefree, doesn't require any attention. A bad invasive outcompetes all the other plants. The populations takes care of themselves. A good ornamental might be something that's easy to propagate. A bad invasive is one that reproduces easily and spreads. A good ornamental may have showy, abundant flowers. A bad invasive, many of them have abundant seeds. So you're starting to see the similarities. One of the reasons we like a good ornamental may be that it attracts birds. A lot of our invasive species, in particular, are woody invasive shrubs, spread through bird dispersed seeds. And finally, we want ornamentals that are disease and pest resistant. And as we talked about, one of the traits of invasive species typically are they are not affected by our native pests and our native diseases. So you can see that our selection process for choosing good ornamentals are also potentially selecting for bad invasives in the future. And so we get a lot of invasive species from this pathway. And in fact, there was some really interesting research a few years ago, about 4 years ago, looking at the percentage of naturalized and the percentage of invasive species across the world that really started through invasive plants across the world that started through this horticulture pathway. And if you look at North America, we're right there about 60%. So roughly about 60% of our invasive plants started out and were introduced through the horticulture pathway. And if you narrow that down a little bit and just look at our woody invasive plants, so our woody vines, our shrubs, our trees, that number goes up even more. And it's actually over 80% of our woody invasive plants in North America were introduced. Their chief reason of being introduced was the horticulture pathway. So again, this is something that is a consequential to conservation by introducing a lot of invasive species. And so if you look around, and a lot of our invaders are beautiful plants and started out as ornamentals. And so mimosa, if you're familiar with that, in the Mid-South, in the lower parts of the Midwest, beautiful cotton candy flowers, major invader in some areas. We have, this is a really sad example of a bush honeysuckle used as an ornamental that I found in front of a store a couple years ago. But as we all know, bush honeysuckle is one of the worst invasive species in the state, just covering acres and acres of forest. Another one might be Miscanthus, which is an ornamental grass. You can find it planted in a lot of people's yards. It's also not hard to find now, spreading and moving in open forest and roadsides and prairies. And another one I like to tout, this one's a little bit newer, I guess you would say, or less known, is this Royal Empress tree, or called Paulownia or Princess tree. And you can find it for sale online, and it's touted as the fastest growing tree in the world. And that should definitely be a red flag if you see that there for something for sale. And so it is an invasive in parts of Illinois and definitely farther south. But this is the Ag Center. This is a shot we took this spring out of a drone of the Ag Center where I work in Southern Illinois. And so if you look, there's all these purple flowering trees in this picture. Those are all Paulownia spreading throughout this Ag Center. And so I've highlighted them here to show you all of them that we found by doing this flight, right? So it's an invader not only farther south, but actually in parts of Illinois. And there's others, right? You can buy teasel. There's little teasel heads that you can buy for $3, so you can use them in your ornamental flower or your dried flower arrangements. But of course, you shouldn't ever pay for teasel, because our roadsides in Illinois unfortunately look like this. And there's even some weird ones like giant hogweed, which is so toxic it can cause chemical burns, or it can cause blindness if it gets the sap in your eyes. Believe it or not, that was used as an ornamental, and it was popular in some circles. And I don't know why you would want a 15-foot tall carrot that could poison you to plant in your yard, but some people did. So you never know, right? So the question comes, why are these invasive species, these plants, still being planted? If we know they're invasive, why are they still on the landscape and why are people still using them? And this is a question that I've thought a lot about over the years and kind of trying to figure out and summarize the reasons why I think people are still using these invasive plants. And I kind of distilled it down into what I think are three major reasons why landowners or anybody with those planting decisions are still using invasive ornamental plants. And one, I think, is a lack of knowledge, right? So I think some people are planting these not even knowing that they're invasive. It never crossed their mind. They just saw it and thought it was a beautiful plant. They saw their neighbor had one, so they decided to plant one. And so it's simply, you know, ignorance, if you'll say, that people just don't know that these species are a problem or never even thought about it. And I think that's probably the biggest group. I think a lot of people, there's a lack of awareness, and we need to work on that as educators out there. The second, I think, is a lack of understanding. So the idea maybe they know, they've heard that that species is invasive, but they don't realize that there's the scope of the problem or just how problematic invasive species are. Right, so they said, well, yeah, you know, that species a problem, but I don't see it spreading around my house, so I don't think it's that big of a deal, something like that. And that's probably the second biggest category. And then a small category is this idea of mistaken identity. And so these are the folks that are trying to do right and plant non-invasive species, but they're mistaken, right? So the species are mislabeled, and they're not getting what they actually are buying. It's something different. And this is not super common, but it does happen. And there was some research a few years ago out of the University of Illinois and the Natural History Survey looking at Oriental bittersweet, roundleaf bittersweet, and American bittersweet, which is our native look-alike, right? So they're very closely related. We tell people to plant the native American bittersweet and not plant the roundleaf or Oriental bittersweet. And so David Zaya, who did this research, basically went out and bought a bunch of American bittersweet from a bunch of different sources. Some were native plant nurseries in person, some were, you know, more box store kind of thing, some were online places, and then did genetic analyses to kind of see, are they really American bittersweet they're selling, or is this just mislabeled Oriental bittersweet? And he actually found that about I think it was over 60% of the time, what he was buying labeled as American bittersweet was actually Oriental bittersweet. So people were mistakenly planting an invasive, thinking they were putting a native in the ground, right? So that's a big issue. That's a problem. Just for interest, we do have some publications out there on our website about how to tell the two apart, especially by the fruit or the fruit size or the flower location, things like that. So you can tell them apart, and once you get a good eye for it, it's easy to tell them apart. But I was blown away by the number of mislabeled plants that are out there for sale. And there's others. There's some kind of up and coming invaders that I think we all should watch out for. Butterfly bush, Budlia, is really starting to get banned in a few states because it's spreading quite a bit. I see it spreading in parts of Kentucky, really, really surprisingly how aggressive it is. And so I think it's one of these new ornamentals or new that are becoming recognized as a problematic invasive. Another is the Amur or Japanese cork tree. That's another one that big full-size tree, but we're seeing it spread. I'm seeing it particularly in areas that had some storm damage, moving fast. And this is both in northern and southern Illinois. We're seeing it kind of across the state. So I believe that one is becoming, rapidly becoming kind of a more widespread invasive. And one that you're probably more familiar with, winter creeper. For a long time, I kind of thought it was just really restricted to old planting sites, you know, at parks or old house sites, but we're seeing more and more of it and it moving through the forest. So I do believe it is becoming more of a serious invader nowadays as well. but I'll spend a bit of time more on these three invasive species. Mainly because I think these three are very, very widely used and are all three very invasive together. And so I think it's worth spending a little more time on these just because of their popularity and their invasiveness. And so the first is colliery pear, and you may be more familiar with some of its ornamental names: Bradford pear, Cleveland pear, Select, all of these flowering pears. They're all the same species, colliery pear, they're just different varieties. It's a small deciduous tree, extremely widely planted as an ornamental, has basically zero wildlife value, and now we're finding them escaped and showing very invasive behavior. And so we see the ornamentals, and they've always had problem with cracking in the wind and things, but it's interesting is when they escape, they really revert back to the wild type, and so they're no longer that tree with the beautiful shape. They get shrubby, they get multi-stem, they actually produce thorns on them, they have little leaves, they almost looks more like a plum. But if you are driving around in early spring, anywhere from late February in southern Illinois through early April in northern Illinois, and you see sites that look like this with white flowering trees on the roadside, you're looking at colliery pear, right? And so this is one of our big new up and coming invaders, really now found across the state. And the question I get a lot about colliery pear is, wasn't this plant sterile? Wasn't it touted as being a plant that was not going to spread? And it was. And the reason why is that this species, colliery pear, is an obligate outcrosser, which means that an individual cannot self-fertilize. So a flower from a colliery pear or pollen from a colliery pear cannot fertilize a flower on that same colliery pear. They have to cross with another individual. Well, each of these varieties are asexually propagated through stem cuttings, which means that Bradford pear, every Bradford pear is genetically the same individual because they're all cuttings. And so that means that they were self-incompatible. So as long as we had one major variety planted on the landscape, there was no fertile fruit being produced because they all could not cross with each other. But what happened was, when a lot of those early varieties or early planted individuals of Bradford pear started breaking in the wind, they developed new varieties, and these new varieties were put on the landscape to replace them. And so suddenly we had enough genetic diversity out there that they were able to cross-pollinate with each other because it was now different genetically individuals. And when that started happening, we saw this rapid explosion of escaped colliery pear on the landscape. The next one's winged burning bush. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this. Tardily deciduous woody shrub, bright red in the fall, really a beautiful plant. Widely dispersed as an ornamental. Birds move the seeds, a well-established invader in many parts of the US. It's prohibited in quite a few states. And so you see, again, a beautiful plant. This is one that we deal with a lot here in my neck of the woods. We have as much burning bush in our forest and invading around here almost as we do honeysuckle. So there's some pockets that are really bad in the state. And just for example, if you look at that top left picture, the ground below those burning bushes has a red hue. That's because it's literally carpet thick with seedlings underneath of it. That's why it looks like that. It's all little red leaves of all the seedlings in there. And so again, this is one that we're seeing spread around. It's bad enough that it's restricted and regulated in other states. And it's I'm sure that this map is underrepresenting where it's at in Illinois. I'm sure it's much farther widespread than that, but that's the data we have here in Illinois. And the last one I'll just mention, barberry. So Japanese barberry, again, widely planted ornamental. There's a ton of different types out there, different shapes, colors, sizes. They typically revert all back to the kind of same wild type once they start escaping. This one is also prohibited from sale in several states. But again, super commonly used ornamental, got those little thorns on them, but there's instances where it's moved around and it's spreading around, and this, like everything in this picture, this is not Illinois picture here, but is all barberry. And I used to think this one wasn't that big of a deal in Illinois, even though it's wide, it looks like it's kind of widespread across the state. But I did a little project a few years ago using data from the update to the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. And so this was a big research project that looked at the highest quality, best habitat, native habitat across the state. And in doing that, they did a lot of floristic studies, and they recorded invasive species at all of these high quality sites all across the state. And so I had the ability to take that data and analyze it for what invasives were where, and was really surprised that Japanese barberry showed up at a really high rate, even in our highest quality native ecosystems. And so even though it's not the most widespread species, it was alarming of how often it showed up in high quality sites. And so that was kind of an alarm bell for me as to take that one a little more seriously here in Illinois. So what are we to do about that? After all of this talk about what invaders we need to worry about and how big of a problem they are, let's talk solutions. What should we do? And this, again, this is, I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's worth talking about. Obviously, we should use and promote native or non-invasive alternatives. I really like promoting native species because of the ecological benefit for them. I think that's one thing that is drastically important out there. Here's just a picture from the Shawnee National Forest of them setting up native plant pollinator gardens in front of their offices. I think that's a great idea just to show the public. And just to brag on myself a little bit, this was my yard, right? So this was an area that we used to mow when I first bought this land, and we converted it to kind of prairie pollinator area, took it out of mow, I took it out of lawn, and I could not be happier. And so this is an area that is my favorite place on my land. You can see my garage up there. This is a shot from a couple years after that, but just to see the development of the native plants kind of in this ornamental plant, not ornamental, but artificial planting. It's all native species, but you know, we just kind of created it. It's not a native ecosystem necessarily, but all these natural native species on the landscape, and to see all the insects that are out there utilizing this site is it's fantastic. I think so. And of course, you have to plug this book from Doug Tallamy. Was really one of the inspirations for us to start that, and I'm sure many of us, talking about how us as landowners and as landscapers and people that own yards, what we can do to sustain wildlife. And the synopsis, the cliff notes is plant more natives, get rid of exotics, put more natives on the landscape, and how the value of those. And it's not really a sacrifice, because there is amazing beauty and diversity of native species here in Illinois that are fairly easy to grow as ornamentals. And so I don't think that we're giving up anything by choosing our native species. And really, there's native species of every color in the rainbow out there in Illinois that you can find, that you can use. And it's just blows me away sometimes when I'm hiking around and looking at all the diversity of plants we have in the state. Something else we can do is control these invasive species, get rid of them, knock them out, either from our ornamental plantings or from our natural environments, controlling them. And I like this little quote from the Nature Conservancy, because I think it really sums up really well why we're doing that. And so they say, we control invasive species because the invasive species are harming the native plants and animals we care so much about protecting. And I like that because it really focuses on the reason why we are concerned about invasive species. It's not because they're exotic. It's not because they're not native to the environment. It's because they're harming our native plants, our natural ecosystems. That's reason why we're controlling them. So I think that's a good synopsis. And add to that, things we can do is learn more about our native ecosystems, learn more about the plants, the animals, the plant communities that are there, so we understand more about them and we care about them more, and we're more concerned about protecting them, and we can raise awareness for everybody else. And so there's great information out there, good guides for Illinois, whether they're print versions, online versions. There's lots of places to go and learn more about Illinois wildflowers, Illinois ecology. I will plug here the Illinois Master Naturalist program. If you are not familiar with that, it is a fantastic program to learn about stewardship and ecology and conservation kind of more in depth. And so look that up. It's with your county extension service. A really a good program. Other things you can do, keep up to date on invasive species listings and distributions. So what's regulated in your state, what's being considered invasive. So for example, in Illinois, we have our Illinois Exotic Weed Act, which regulates our invasive species. For a while, it was just these different species: buckthorns, loosestrife, kudzu, Japanese honeysuckle, and multiflora rose. But in 2015, we went through a big update, and we added quite a few new species. And the Illinois Exotic Species Council is restarted as well now, and looking to restart this assessment and look at what else do we need to add to these lists. So it's good to know kind of what's regulated and what's not in the state. And finally, the thing we can do is spread the word, not the weeds, right? So get more information out there, learn more about invasives, and get other people to learn more about invasives. And there's some great resources out there. One of the best websites that's out there now that I would highly recommend you all look at is this Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative. They call themselves Wiggle, W-I-G-L. Their website has wonderful pictures, great information on controlling invasives, on ecology, lots of really, really good stuff. So I would highly recommend utilizing them or looking them up if you want to get a lot of good information about invasives, to learn more yourself or to share that knowledge out there. And there's some really goofy ways to do it. And there's some funny, creative slogans out there that you can get people's attention. I don't know if those are the best or not, but there's certainly fun to look at and things like that. But it's everybody trying to be creative to let more people know about the problem of invasives. So I will end now with this, the Voluntary Codes of Conduct, which was a product of this 2002 big meeting at the Missouri Botanical Gardens, where a lot of people from the horticulture industry and others kind of came together to come up with these voluntary codes of how that they as an industry, as a discipline, needs to deal with invasive species. And so I like these. I think they are interesting, and this is for general groups, and there's some for just trade, there's some for scientists, there's a lot, and some for landowners. But there's some basic things that everybody could agree on. Stuff like you should introduce plants in a manner that minimizes the chance to becoming invasive. You should understand there's regional differences to invasive species and take that into account when preventing them. Look at early detection as a very good technique. We need more training, more public education. We need to come together and use all the tools that we can to deal with these things. And so I think it's a good, that's a big document. If you ever want to read that and kind of understand more about the role of botanical gardens and the role of the horticulture industry with invasive species, it is it's a fascinating kind of series of documents. So I'd recommend that. So I will leave that here with my email and our Facebook page. We're very, very active on Facebook. We do a lot of stuff with invasive species and native plants. So feel free to follow us. Feel free to look us up on our website, which is just extension.illinois.edu/forestry. We have lots of our resources there. We have a YouTube channel where we put a lot of our webinars up. So feel free to get more information or to get a hold of me if you have questions or anything after we're done here tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. We do have some questions for you.
Okay.
Somebody mentioned that winter creeper is extremely invasive in southern Indiana.
Certainly. Yep.
So when you see, this question for you, when you see an invasive plant in a forest, do you do anything to it, such as try to remove it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some level of care you have to take into account. Like if you're on a public land and you see an invasive, I generally do. If it's just one invader here or something like that, that I feel that me pulling that up can make a difference, I will. Be pretty careful about that because some places, may not understand that you're pulling an invasive. They may grouse at you for pulling a plant out of their protected area. So you might have some explaining of why you're doing that. But no, I do that. I think if you're walking by and there's 16 acres of honeysuckle, pulling a plant won't really do anything. But if you're in a nice area where there's little invasive species and you find one or two, that can actually be pretty impactful. So yeah, I do that. And it bothers my wife sometimes because we're hiking as a family and suddenly I'll veer off the trail, walk into the woods and rip a plant out of the ground and then come back. And when we're hiking with friends, it confuses them some.
I also want to mention when you say that most of, if not all, forest preserve districts will have volunteer days where people can help pull invasive species. And, I know in Cook County, there's the Friends of the Forest Preserves and other organizations. So if you want to pull invasive species and not get in trouble for it, just do it as a group.
Absolutely. And that's a great comment for sure. Absolutely. It's a great way to be involved. And some sites have kind of long-term volunteers called volunteer site stewards. So not only are you involved in these volunteer days, but they actually, through working with them over time, you build up kind of more ownership, if you will, of the site, and you kind of work on your own even than some. So there's definitely a multitude of ways of getting involved.
Pulling out those invasives is a great form of stress relief.
Absolutely. Yep.
Kathy asks, so are all cultivars of barberry invasive?
So there's of Japanese barberry, so that's the one we're talking about here. There's varying levels of seed production from them. And so there's been a lot of work looking at all the different cultivars. And generally what they found is some cultivars produce a lot less seed, quite a bit. But in general, all the cultivars produce some level of viable seed. And when that seed escapes, it reverts back to the wild type. So there isn't necessarily what I would consider a safe cultivar of barberry. There's some that produce less seed and would be a little less impactful, if you will. But there's none that's going to be like, this is a safe one that will not escape, as far as I know.
Okay. People are commenting on how beautiful your yard is.
I agree completely.
When a plant is regulated, what does that mean? Does that mean that the state of Illinois prohibits its sale? Or what actually does regulated mean?
That's a great question, and it varies depending upon the particular type of regulation. The one I talked about was the Illinois Exotic Weed Act. The Illinois Exotic Weed Act does just that. It regulates sale, transport, purchase, anything like that where you're moving that plant, you're planting that plant, you're selling it, you're buying it. So if you have it on your land, if you've got an infestation of honeysuckle, they're not going to require you to kill all that honeysuckle, but you can't dig it up and give it to your neighbor, or you couldn't buy new ones and things like that. There's other regulations like the Noxious Weed Act, which does regulate possession. So if it's on your land, they have the ability to say, you need to get rid of that. We're going to force you to. But the exotic weed list, which is the one that primarily regulates invasive plants in Illinois, is just regulating transport and sale and commerce.
The Noxious Weed Act there's nothing on, I mean, what are some of the ones that are on that list? That nothing that like people that are listening to this would have on their property that they would be in trouble for harboring, right?
Well, it could, yeah. I mean, there's some, right? So the noxious weed list is typically agricultural problems. So that's kind of where it goes in there. But there are some, crossover. So one example would be Johnson grass. So Johnson grass in the southern half of the state is a major invader, both of agricultural lands and native lands, and it's on the noxious weed list. Now, I will add a caveat to that, is that the enforcement of that noxious weed list is up to each county, and each county does it differently, with some counties not doing it at all. So I can't guarantee that you would get fined or forced to control it. It really depends on the local situation.
Should I dig out my burning bush and get rid of it?
That's a good question. So I hesitate to tell people to do that because I know there's an economic cost involved with that. So, and I don't want to force people to do things like that. But what I will say is it would be a very good thing to do. And then you're preventing that burning bush from contributing to invasion and spreading. At a minimum, I would ask, as you're making those planting choices and you're getting rid of that, or you're adding new species to it or whatever, at that point, think about this and think about choosing different species. Again, it would be great to get rid of it, and I think everybody should get rid of it, but I'm not at the point where I'm saying you need to do it, right? Because I'm not going to force people to make those choices. But yeah, it's a good thing to replace. I think so. If that is diplomatic enough of an answer.
I'm gonna make a big confession to everybody here.
Oh.
I re-landscaped my whole front yard to native plants this summer, but I have to confess I have a calorie pear in my parkway. And I'm really struggling with this. I keep hoping that a storm will knock it down so I won't have to worry about this, because it's a perfectly healthy, perfectly shaped tree that gives me some shade and it gives me privacy. And if I cut it down and start fresh, I'm going to have a popsicle in my parkway, and I'm really struggling with this. But every year when I, like at this time, when I see all those things that are coming off of it, like I guess they're berries or whatever, and I'm thinking, I'm not that close to the forest preserves, but I'm a few miles from the forest preserves. So I feel very guilty. I'm having like a crisis of, like a native plant crisis going on here. Do I remove the pear tree? If it would just break in a lightning storm, I wouldn't, the decision would be made.
Yep.
Are all buckthorns bad? I have 2 mature buckthorns in my yard and wonder if I should cut them down.
I would guess if they're in your yard, then yeah, they are the bad ones. That would be my guess. Now, I can't say that for sure, but we do have 2 at least native buckthorns in Illinois. So we have Carolina buckthorn, which I would highly recommend anybody using, which is a gorgeous native ornamental small tree or big shrub. We also have lance leaf buckthorn, which is a small kind of rare one. And then we have some other plants that aren't related to buckthorns, but they're called buckthorns. There's woolly buckthorn, which is actually a state endangered plant or state threatened, one of the two. But if it's in your yard, it's probably either going to be glossy buckthorn or European or common buckthorn, which are the ones that are highly problematic. And if you look at the most recent tree analysis from the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, they found something like 30% or so of the trees in Illinois are buckthorns, and it's the exotic ones just in the Chicago region, I mean. So yeah, it's probably those, and my answer would be the same as should you cut them down, is my answer for the person before you that asked about the burning bush.
If somebody's not sure what is growing in their yard and they're wondering if it's a buckthorn or if it's an autumn olive or what it is, what app or source do you recommend? Like what do you think is the best app to give a accurate idea of what it is that they're dealing with?
Mhm.
Or if they don't have an app and they're not, they don't want to do that technology, is there a place where they can send or take a leaf sample to find out?
So I'm going to plug extension here. So we have offices in every county. So you can either send a picture to extension. If you want to take a picture, you can take a stem cutting and put a little, put it in a bag or put some wet paper towels around it so it won't wilt, and bring it into the extension office. If they don't know it in the extension office, they'll probably take a picture of it and send it to me. So I think extension, that's one of the roles that we can play, is helping landowners identify what they have on their land, identifying unknown plants, and we're happy to do that. So I would certainly plug extension. If you want to go the app route, there's several good ones. I think iNaturalist or Seek are both really good ones as well, that you can use, and there's others. So I'm not promoting one over the other, but just do your do research and try this, whichever ones work best for you, with the caveat that, again, you're relying on a kind of computer generated ID that are not always accurate. So I like, asking an expert.
Pears are bad in Will County. I know, rub it in. Thank you so much. This is a great presentation. Can we get a recording of this show, or will it be available somewhere? Yes, we are recording it. And Chris has said that we can put it, it'll be on our YouTube channel within the next week. So look up the Sag Moraine on YouTube. I believe that Chris is also going to put it on your YouTube channel as well, correct?
I won't put this one since you guys are recording it, but I have similar recordings to this on my YouTube channel. There's, I think, similar things when I'm talking about ornamental invaders. I have a whole webinar just on like the introduction to invasives. And so you can find a lot of that stuff there too.
On our street, we have all planted natives in our front yards. That's great. I'd like to know where you are. We have a couple of restoration work days coming up at Sagawa Environmental Learning Center in Lamont. Come on out. So if anybody, if whoever put that in, Leslie, if you put that in, where would people go? Just on the Sagawa, the Cook County Forest Preserve District website, and find out about that day, those days, and great information. If we notice someone selling a plant on that is on the exotic weed list, who do we contact to report it?
If a place is selling it, so it's a nursery that's selling a species that's on the exotic weed list, you should contact the Illinois Department of Agriculture. So they have nursery inspectors, and those nursery inspectors are should visit their nursery every year, and so they are the people to work with. So I would call and just look them up online. I think they have environmental services. I forgot what the particular title is, but the Department of Ag is who you would contact.
Is there any governing body trying to stop nurseries in the landscape industry to stop buying using invasives such as burning bush, barberry, etc.?
That's a good question. So we have in Illinois a newly formed Illinois Invasive Species Council, which the nursery industry is involved in, as well as scientists and natural resource people. And so through that group, we're trying to look at what species we can regulate and what species we can reduce demand for through education, a lot of other things. And so that group is working with the governing bodies. It's a nonprofit itself, but to really kind of tackle these issues with industry, with the horticulture industry. Other states are looking at other kind of regulatory ways as well, but it is something that is constantly being talked about, and progress is slow but being made.
What about great presentation? Thank you, Carol. What about canary reedgrass? It looks to have taken over parts of Willow Springs woods. How do you get rid of it?
So reed canary grass is a very tough one to get rid of because of its really abundant root system that's connected. So we typically get rid of it through multiple applications of herbicide. A lot of times we'll mow it or burn it first, and then have the flush of new growth come up, and then you would spray it at that point in time. There's a couple different herbicides you can use, depends on the situation, but really it's something that takes multiple treatments. It's a hard one to get rid of.
How do you feel about nativars, such as cultivated purple coneflowers, for example?
That's a good question. So nativars, some people don't like them because they don't have the wildlife value there. And I understand that because these cultivated versions, they, they have mutations in them that basically have more petals or things like that. I am okay with them as a replacement for ornamentals, but you also have to realize that that's in a purely ornamental situation. I like more of an ecological situation where I would not use them. I would use the local genetics and the wild type, definitely, because that's what ecologically is going to be the most beneficial. But if you have something in your front yard and you want to replace your Cosmos or zinnias with a nativar coneflower that's there, I don't have a problem with that either. But again, understanding the different situations between a single ornamental versus an ecological restoration, and there's very different uses there.
You're welcome, Irene. She loves the presentation and is glad that she's going to be able to see the recording.
Nice.
And yes, if anybody wants to help out with pulling invasives at Sagawa in Lamont, go to the Forest Preserve District of Cook County website and you'll find information. I think you can actually go to look at the specific place or look up events and go through and see the different events that are happening at Sagawa. Again, great stress relief. Okay. Thank you, Chris. All right, so any last call, any questions, any more questions? All righty, I did want to just mention, because you mentioned Doug Tallamy's book, and we will be, Sagmarine will be having Doug Tallamy give a webinar for us on February 17th. He'll be presenting the little things that run the world, so keep an eye on our website for that. We'll be having signups for that coming up soon. And thank you so much, Chris. This was wonderful, and I'm feeling so guilty about that pear in my parkway. Can you just come take it out? And I'll be so happy tomorrow that it's gone and I don't have to make the decision.
That's a little outside of my job description, but tell you what, send me a picture.
Anybody out there, just do it.
Send me a picture of the stump when you cut it down, and I'll give you a lot of praise. A lot of kudos.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.